All right. I don't know. Can we see like how many people are coming in? Like, can I see like numbers?
I think we've got like 1 million people already. It's just crazy.
Yeah. So, well, pretty much, I just don't want to like introduce the whole thing without people being here.
Oh, well, we're on. We're live.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, hey guys, welcome to the FreeThinking broadcast. Hey, there it is. No, Tim, you said that a couple, I don't know, a couple streams ago, and I really dug it. So I think I'm gonna steal it from you. But yeah, so finally, you guys let me be on one of these things and didn't schedule it when I was busy. So that's nice. But yeah, we're gonna be talking about sort of a conversation that that you guys started last week, having to do with the riots and the protests that have been going on in the wake of the George Floyd murder. And so my name's Scott Olson. As you can see, with me today is Tim Stratton, Timothy Fox, and Adam Coleman, all of FreeThinking Ministries. It's good to be with you guys. Yeah, so for this whole thing, it's going to be very confusing for me. So I'm just going to call Tim Stratton, and then Tim Fox, either Tim or Fox.
Fox. That's what we agreed on last
Stratton,
week.
Fox. Dope. Okay. Sounds good.
And you can just call me Strat. You can call me Strat. Yeah.
We'll see if I remember to do that. You know, I'm just going to call you Tim. But so Strat, you wrote an article called an open letter to Christians condoning violence, which I did text you as soon as I saw you post that. I wanted to go back into the website and change the title of that to be a letter to Christians, condoning violence, to totally change the meaning of what people were looking for. But
Christians,
yeah, a letter to Christians condoning violence. But you got a little bit of feedback from it that I believe it's fair to say you weren't necessarily expecting, especially from other Christians in this space. And I thought we could take some time and talk about that today.
Yeah, it's probably a good idea, and it's just, I think it's been so healthy to have these conversations. Adam and I were talking before we went live here, and we said that we don't always know how to have these conversations, but it's important to just have them and to give each other grace when you say something stupid, when you say something that's not quite right, to say, hey, we might be seeing things differently here. We might wind up totally disagreeing with each other, but let's give each other grace to have this conversation, even if we don't know how to do it, knowing that we're probably going to say things that might offend each other, knowing that we're going to say some sloppy things, but hey, the conversation is vital. We've got to have this conversation, even if it's sloppy and messy. We're going to give each other grace. And so,
can I interrupt you right there?
Please do.
Let me just put one caveat that, like, let's just outlaw and make sure we're not using terms white blessing, though. That's a no-go zone. We can't use the term white blessing.
What is that? I've never heard that phrase before.
Oh, y'all aren't up on that. Okay.
Well, I mean, hey, I've heard privilege. I've heard fragility. I mean, hey, just dump another one on me while you're at it.
Oh, I would say, well, see, you guys aren't up on the headlines, man. We're supposed to be current events, man.
You know what you get to say then? Y'all ain't white.
Yeah,
I missed last week's white person meeting.
So within the last couple of days, I guess it was like maybe last week, there was this panel discussion with Louis Giglio, Lecrae, and I forgot the other gentleman that was there.
Oh, okay.
Louis Giglio referred to, I guess he substituted the word white privilege with white blessing. He's catching a lot of flack. I think rightfully so. It's kind of a dumb way to phrase it, but so that joke just basically failed. But I was just throwing out there that one caveat.
Okay.
So we've got grace to say anything except for white blessing. So.
Right.
See, I love the fact that we can even joke around about this stuff.
Oh, of course, yeah.
As brothers in Christ, So I hope that this is just an example, just for everybody else watching. Even if you're watching this and you disagree with us, we just want to know that we want to give you grace. We hope that you would give us grace. I know that I'm probably going to say some stupid stuff. And so I ask in advance for grace and forgiveness.
And it's recorded on YouTube forever.
No pressure. So yeah, I guess it's really kind of started a couple weeks ago. I was shocked to see how many Christian leaders, whether they be pastors or others with a Christian influence on social media, seemed to be what I thought was turning a blind eye to all of the violence in the streets that we're following in the wake of George Floyd's death. And I was clear in our last video. I believe that was murder. It was horrible, completely unjustified, and I was so angry when I saw that video. But I was expecting many protests. I felt like protesting myself in a God-honoring way, but then all of this violence broke out, and so I was expecting to see many Christians using their position of influence to speak out against the violence and these sinful riots and the looting and even the murder. There was more murders resulting from a murder, and we've always been taught that two wrongs don't make a right. Well, now we're seeing a whole bunch of wrongs, and a whole bunch of wrongs don't make a right either. But sadly, it seemed to me that many who should have been speaking about it weren't. Many were silent. In fact, a few went even further, and they actually took to my Facebook wall or my page, and they seemed to support the violence. It was at least implied, heavily implied, that they were supporting the violence, maybe implying that this was a God-honoring violence. Now, I want to be clear that murder is horrible. It's a sin. Destroying other people's property is not as bad. I believe there's different degrees of sin, but sin is still sin. But destroying other people's property is bad enough. It's a sin. But when I saw other people getting murdered because somebody got murdered, and there was even other minorities and other Black people who were getting murdered as a result of this. I mean, I simply had enough, and I hammered out what I thought was going to be a good Facebook post. And so let me read to you what I said here. I said, any Christian, especially a Christian influencer, who has a platform to speak out against and condemn the sinful violence, not to be confused with God-honoring peaceful protests, yet fails to do so, should be ashamed. And I went on and added, to Christians who actually support this evil, hoping that the ends justify the means, shame on you. You've lost the right to speak of consistent Christianity ever again. Now, I hammered that out, and I was going to post it on Facebook, but before I published it or posted it, I texted our very own Tim Fox, and I said, hey, what do you think of this? And Fox replied something.
You need to write an article out of that.
Bro, write the article.
You need to write the article. And I'm saying I texted him day and night. Did you write it yet? Did you write it yet? Did you write it yet? No lie.
Yeah. And and you guys always joke around that I'm always telling you guys,
write the article. Tim, I gotta run to the bathroom, man. Can you write an article about that?
I thought he was serious. I'm like, we're on live, dude.
No. That's part of the
joke. When I wrote my article on anarchism, I sent it to Tim, and Tim's like, okay, this article though.
Yeah, that's right. That was like one I was a little hesitant of, but I'm like, all right, we got it. And please, Scott, it's kind of interesting that you wrote an article and then we did 3 podcasts about anarchy and if anarchism is biblical.
And you see it happening live now.
I don't know about that one.
I'm surprised you're not living in CHOP right now.
Yeah. Flights this weekend.
Yeah.
Man. Well, make sure we get we'll do a live stream once you get there.
Yeah. What were we talking about again? Article, something?
Who knows?
Hey, Scott, we should probably do a live stream in the future about your views about anarchism compared to what we're saying today. That's everybody is calling anarchy.
Right. Yeah.
So we'll table that for later.
Sounds good.
So anyway, back to the story here. Fox told me I had to write an article, and since I'm the one that's always telling people to write articles, I thought I better listen. So I grabbed my laptop, and for the first time ever, I wrote an article in reverse because I had that Facebook post ready to go, and Fox said, "Hey, you should end with that." So I wrote an article backwards, And I actually started with the conclusions and ended with the first line. In fact, the very first line was the last thing I wrote. And it was simply this: Christians have been called by God to change the world. So I wrote the article backwards. So I've never done that. I thought that was kind of cool. You guys should try it.
That's, I believe in logic, that's called, reasoning from your conclusion.
Yeah. maybe I'm guilty of that.
No, that's good. Yeah. So I don't know. Did you guys have anything you wanted to say about kind of like that whole thing, Fox, Adam?
I mean, I was all about it. I was the one telling him, dude, you need to write that. It's not enough. I told him that needed to be the snippet that went right before the article, but he needed to fully flesh it out. Because some people don't know, well, why is he telling me shame on you? Because that's all everybody does on social media, shame each other. But it was justified. That's the thing. I believe he was fully justified in saying shame on you. A lot of Christians took umbrage to that, but I thought Paul did it. Who has bewitched you? Like Paul did it, like he used some strong language, and I think he was justified in that. But it needed to be fully fleshed out for people to understand, all right, here's the logic behind not just shaming you, and plus writing long articles is what Strat does. So, I mean.
Yeah. Right. I mean, no, and I mean, I think that he was right to call out the violence and the looting. I mean, I think I said it last time I was up here. I think that given the context that we're in, I don't think that people have expended all the options that we have at our disposal that one would need to do before they can resort to violence in these kinds of cases. That's kind of like my take on it. With that being said, and I don't know if we want to get into it now or after we get into the article some, but I think, one of the things I want to do with these discussions is to kind of just, lay it all out there, you know what I'm saying? And just be transparent, I know for myself, when the riots were breaking out and everything was just kind of going haywire, I felt conflicted, in some ways. I felt really conflicted and hesitant to speak out against the looting and the riots, and I know that sounds crazy, but part of it has to do with, I think, maybe like this, what I consider to be like this underlying issue of culpability. And I think what I mean by that is, and I'm just going to lay it out. I think that there's this fear amongst, and I'll just be explicit, I think amongst like Black people and white people, I think there's this fear of culpability. It's like, if you say something about the riots, then the fear in the Black community is that, we've skipped over the racism and we're focusing on maybe evil responses to the racism. You know what I'm saying? But we need to do but racism is important and we need to address that. And so if you're not addressing that, but if you're addressing this other stuff, then it's like, well, you don't really care about the racism part. And then the flip side of that is the fear is that, okay, well, yeah, I mean, obviously, George Floyd was murdered brutally. And I believe that there was racism involved. People can disagree about that. But nevertheless, there's a race problem. And then they might say, well, yeah, but, we still need to not be, looting and burning up other people's property. That's important too. And I feel like what happens in these discussions, there's like this hot potato of blame, and people are passing the hot potato around, not realizing that, really sometimes there's enough blame to go around. There's more than one hot potato, and we need to engage that and understand that, just because I'm speaking against looting and rioting doesn't mean that I don't, walk with you in your rage against the death of George Floyd. You know what I'm saying? And just because I, maybe I empathize, with somebody. Now I don't empathize with people who are just out there just doing stupid stuff because they can. You know what I'm saying? But I empathize with the person who's enraged enough about George Floyd that they want to take action, and they find themselves protesting amidst all these other people who are out there for stupid reasons. Like, I empathize with that person. And so it's like, man, there's this weird, dynamic. And I feel like that's something that has to be addressed. You know what I'm saying? I feel like that's something that has to be taken into account. Like, so like, when I read Tim's article, I didn't see somebody saying, hey, racism was bad, but, we need to focus on the rights. I didn't see that. I'm saying what I saw was somebody saying that, yeah, I mean, I've been saying that this George Floyd thing was messed up. I'm against racism. I've written whole articles on it. And I'm still against the looting. I'm saying I think that's really appropriate. You know what I'm saying? But in terms of, so anyway, coming back to myself, I think that's sometimes why I feel hesitant, to speak against certain things, because it's like, I don't want to give people who really are trying to brush racism under the rug, and I get them on my timeline all the time. I'm saying I don't want to give them any leverage. I'm saying I don't want to give them a wedge to continue to bypass, real issues of sin that people who are in Christ ought to be standing against. And so it's a real weird, dynamic, man. It's a real weird dynamic.
Well, I hear you saying that it's a both and. Christians can speak truth to everything.
Yeah.
No, it should. Yeah, absolutely. Right.
It's not an either or. It's not an either or. It's a both and.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Hey, we have a good question here from Chester Sweeney. Chester asks, what percentage of protesters do you think contribute to rioting and looting? And I have no idea. I just know it's way too much. It's way too many, way too many people. I don't know. Have you guys seen any stats?
Well, I don't know that. I don't even know how that would be possible to get like a head count. To say, I'm not sure.
Why are you doing this?
But I will say this though. I will say this, and now I'm basing this upon what I'm seeing on the news, but also I have family members, in Richmond, Virginia, who've been going out to some of the riots and can attest to this as well. Number one, it's not like it's just a bunch of black people running around breaking stuff. That's not even close to the case.
No.
But what you do see is you see this hodgepodge of people who are really upset about what's going on in our country in terms of George Floyd and beyond. There's this contingent of them, but then there's this, I think there's a larger number of people who are of mixed ethnicities and so forth, who are out there just wrecking shop for other agendas. You know what I'm saying? I'm not going to say his name, but my brother-in-law, my brother mentioned, he put it on Facebook as well. He was out there in Richmond and he witnessed, he said, I'm trying to quote him as best I can, but he said that when he was out there, you could tell the ones who were out there for the protests and had a concern about that. And you could tell the ones who were out there just to cause mayhem, and the ones who were there to cause mayhem, in his words, appeared to be very coordinated in what they were doing. Mm-hmm. They weren't just running around haphazardly, just breaking stuff. You could see them in the crowd moving in a coordinated manner, causing harm and destruction. This is what he observed. And I think this has been attested to on the news as well. And I recognize it's anecdotal, but it seems that observation has been made in various different places. And so I think you have, whether people like it or not, I think that the race issue that stemmed from George Floyd obviously needs to be addressed. We cannot turn a blind eye, though, that there are other groups that are, I think, trying to take advantage of all the hoopla, so to speak, and insert their, kind of impose their will in this situation. So in terms of percentages, I have no idea, but I do know that there's far too many people doing wrong, if you will, that I don't think is indicative of those who are out there, for the right reasons.
That's said.
Yeah. No, it'd be really hard to determine what that percentage is.
Yeah. See some people here talking about 50% and 40%. I don't know. I don't know how you'd reach those conclusions.
Yeah, Fox, you mentioned like asking people. It's like, so you just threw that brick through that window. Now, was that because of your anger in the George Floyd situation?
It's tough. And where'd that brick come from, by the way? When you see these screenshots with like cages of bricks, it's just like, did someone just go to Lowe's and buy a whole pallet of bricks? But like, maybe. Where are these bricks coming from? And all these cages full of rocks. It's just like, I don't think these are protesters. These are like professional protesters.
Right.
Professional protesters.
Somebody throws a rock or a brick, you say, "Yo, what do you mean by that?" Take a tactics approach.
Well, and it's not like if you're there and you're protesting and your intent is peaceful protest. It's not like if there's a pallet of bricks there, you're just like, "Oh shit, I can't just walk by and not throw these at these things, I gotta do it." So clearly, like, the pallets of bricks are there for the people who have intentions of being violent. Now, whether that's for protest reasons or just because they like causing chaos.
I think to the point though, that's why I think conversations like these are so important, because there's so many different layers to the human experience that CNN and Fox News can't capture in sound bites, and you can't capture it just on YouTube and Facebook. This is real life, and I think that there are dynamics to it that can be really difficult. You know what I'm saying? Like I said, there really are people who just don't care, that racism is an issue in America today, and would love to focus on looters, everything but racism. You know what I'm saying? Critical race theory, BLM, whatever. They would love to focus on those things to the exclusion of dealing with racism. And for people like that, it makes it difficult for people like myself to be able to engage in those kind of things. It's like, well, look, I definitely don't rock with Black Lives Matter as an organization. You know what I'm saying?
What was that?
No, I said I definitely don't rock with Black Lives Matter as an organization. I mean, if you just look at their views, I mean, I don't think there's any way that a Christian could and be consistent. You know, with that being said, I do think that I do ask the question, like, you know, I think people have to ask the question, why does that statement resonate with so many people? Yeah. You know, like, how is it that simple statement has gained so much traction? And I think it's because it speaks to something that's very real. And if anything, we need to deal with that real thing. But if folks are so concerned about the organization and never get back around to dealing with what I believe to be, I think, a more fundamental issue, then it becomes really difficult to have these conversations and get anywhere. You know,
what I hate to see is an evil or just a wrong organization, if that makes sense. Well, I'll call it an evil organization hijacking an objectively true term and use it for their name. I mean, even Antifa, being anti-fascism.
That's a good thing.
Right, but Antifa is horrible. Right? It's so horrible. Right. So yeah, I hate to say. I mean, Black Lives Matter. Amen to that. And I've actually, because in the past I'd be like, well, of course every life matters, but I've even recently realized why that statement why you shouldn't brush it away and say, well, yeah, it's true, all life matters. So yeah, of course Black Lives Matter. I understand the intent behind it now, so that's a good thing. That's come from this, Sure. But yeah, hey, Matt Smith says hi, and he says, so do you think critical race theory and conflict theory watered down the conversation?
I'm not sure about conflict theory. I mean, I'd have to think about that.
What does he mean by conflict theory?
Yeah, I've never heard that phrase before.
I wonder if you, because see, critical race theory and critical theory are distinct, but they kind of, critical race theory would be like it's like I don't know,
a version of.
Yeah, version of. Yeah, there you go. It's a version of critical theory. So I don't know if you meant critical race theory and critical theory. I mean, I can give you my own take on critical race theory and how I think it affects it. I don't know if that's where we want to go now, but I mean, I kind of know it's supposed to.
Let's hold off on that because I think as we discuss the article a little more, we'll see.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we'll get around to that. Yeah.
So Tim, for those people who, God forbid, have not read your article, maybe come on, but maybe you could give us some of like the main points of what you're trying to make during that article. Okay.
Well, I started after saying Christians have been called to change the world by recommending a book. And if you're out there, if you wonder if Christianity has done a good job changing the world for the better, read the book entitled How Christianity Changed the World by Alvin J. Schmidt. And, and after that, I pointed out how many atheists and agnostics today are beginning to realize the importance of a biblical worldview for the sake of a civilized culture. So even if these folks don't think the Bible is true, even if they think that God does not exist, they're still starting to see that, yeah, but it's these beliefs, even if they think they're false beliefs, that have led to a civilized culture. And even the atheist Phil Zuckerman has stated that when he thinks about Christianity, that there's three things that come to mind as what he calls its core elements. And so the core elements would be love, peace or nonviolence, and forgiveness. So love, peace / nonviolence, and forgiveness. And he adds that these three principles are the heart of any civil society. And he notes that he says Christianity has contributed much to civilization in terms of moral progress. And there's no question that Christians give more today in terms of charity, volunteering, and service compared to secular Americans. And it's not even, you think about the most aggressive atheist of our time. Probably Richard Dawkins is going to come to mind first. And this is what Richard Dawkins recently said. He says, quote, "There are no Christians, as far as I know, blowing up buildings. I am not aware of any Christian suicide bombers. I'm not aware of any major Christian denomination that believes the penalty for apostasy is death. I have mixed feelings about the decline of Christianity, insofar as Christianity might be a bulwark against something worse. And then Tom Holland, who's a historian and agnostic, I think he leans towards atheism.
Spider-Man.
Not that Holland. The other guy, the other Holland, other Tom Holland. He says this: the West has moved. The West has moved on to shape concepts like international law, concepts like human rights. Ultimately, they don't go back to Greek philosophers. They don't go back to the Roman Empire. They go back to the Apostle Paul. His letters with the four Gospels are the most influential, most impactful, the most revolutionary writings that have emerged from the ancient world. So I think it's pretty cool to see that, not only has an entire book been written about how Christianity has changed the world for the better, even atheists are coming to see that, wow, Christianity, we have gotten ideas like objective and unalienable human rights from Christianity. I mean, that stemmed the Declaration of Independence. I mean, we can talk about systemic racism in our country. I think there is a conversation to be said about that. But I also want to point out that there's also systemic freedom in our country because of its philosophical foundations, that all men, all people are created equal, that we're given rights granted to us by our Creator. This is a Christian concept. And because of that, these human rights that all humans possess should not be violated by anybody, including our own government. Well, what did our government do right after laying our philosophical foundations? Well, we allowed for evils to happen. Fortunately, we have realized that because of our philosophical foundations, that these are things that we ought to try to change. So I don't know. What are your thoughts on that, guys?
Yeah, there's an interesting speech given by Frederick Douglass called, actually, I think I mentioned it last time, what's the slave of the 4th of July? I have a whole show on it. So actually, I won't rehash all of that. But, it kind of gets to this idea that, at America's foundings, you do have, woven into, our foundations, a number of different Christian ethics that I think have allowed for America to be, more approximate to God's, moral standard than we otherwise would be. There's no doubt about that. Now it's almost like, to your point, that it's kind of like, I'm going to jack up the verse, but it's like Paul says, things that I would do, I do not, and all that kind of stuff. I think that's kind of like American history. It's like, you have like these ideals, and then you have, like this back and forth of attaining them. You know what I'm saying? And I think that sometimes it's easy, maybe depending on the person, it's easy to kind of lean one way or the other in terms of what's the right lens to look at it through. But, to your point, though, I don't think that the abolitionist movement, for example, or the civil rights movement, I don't think there's any way that either of those movements would have been possible or successful, rather, if they weren't appealing to biblical ideas that were already present in the public square. And they explicitly say that. If you think about, like, Dr. King during the I Have a Dream speech and others, they're explicitly appealing to biblical ideas. And if those ideas weren't already present in the public square, there would have been no leverage for moral progress. Yeah. As a matter of fact, I was talking to, I won't say who it was. It was a private conversation I had with some gentlemen it was last night or the night before. And, they were atheists, described themselves as being determinists. And, they were asking questions about slavery and the Bible and so forth. And, one of them made a statement about moral progress. That we progressed from such and such to such and such. I'm like, well, wait a minute. If atheism is true and you're a determinist, then there's no objective starting point or end game for morality. I'm saying there is no from or to be had. So there is no moral progress. Martin Luther King is no more a reformer than, Adolf Hitler, I'm saying, in a positive way.
Yeah.
So, ideas really matter, and I do think that one of the things that I certainly appreciate about this America's history is that you do have this cobbling together of different sets of ideas, and fortunately, we see the biblical worldview in that mix, man, in ways that have allowed us to triumph over some real important or serious hurdles.
Yeah. But do you think that's what we're missing nowadays? That we're missing like key biblical figures in the racial conversation? Because yeah, like you're saying, they came from religious, Christian, fundamental Christian beliefs. But is there any voice nowadays who's going from a fundamental Christian perspective?
Well, that's a good question. And I mean, I don't know, were you asking me or just, I guess I'll take a stab at it, because actually I'm going to tie it back to something that Tim Stratton said about the Black Lives Matter organization. To be honest with you, I abhor everything that they stand for in terms of their charter. You know what I'm saying? Now, I mean, well, other than the legitimate parts about Black Lives Mattering, but I mean, in terms of views on the family and things of that nature. I mean, and people who have looked at their website know what I mean. There are things that I abhor about it. At the same time, I almost, in some ways, lay their existence at the feet of the church. There's a guy that says, and I'm gonna mess his name up, and probably mess the quote up too. But he talks about how cults are the unpaid bills of the church. And I would say the same thing about Black Lives Matter. And the reason why I say that, and people can get mad if they want, it doesn't, whatever. But the bottom line is, the Bible says a lot about justice. It says a whole lot about what it means to live out the Imago Dei in the public square, in relationships, being even a citizen. The Bible has a whole lot to say about that. And, as people who are called to be Christ-like, called to be, the very essence of what an image bearer is, when the church abdicates its place in the public square of being that force for good and justice, when we take ourselves out of the mix, then we create a vacuum within which other groups can step in and then try to bring forth like a caricaturist version of whatever it is that the good really looks like. And then, analogously, now I recognize I'm using a war example, people may not be aware of it, but, in the Middle East right now, one of the reasons that ISIS was able to gain so much traction is because after the assassination of Saddam Hussein, it left a power vacuum to where they said, well, forget it. We're not going to be struggling over here trying to fight against, Assad. We're just going to go over here to Iraq where there's no power. There's this power gap. We're going to fill in over there and create our ISIS state. So this vacuum is created. And so what I'm saying is that when Christians don't do their due diligence to exemplify what it means to live out what Jesus refers to as the weightier matters, justice, mercy, and faithfulness, when we don't do that, then we create a situation where others are going to step in and botch the job. Like nobody should be louder for justice in society than the church. Nobody.
Yeah. Yeah.
It shouldn't ever be the case that anybody should have to look to a Black Lives Matter to live out the biblical ethic of justice.
Right.
You have some in-house civic organizations by which we can, be the arm of Christ in the world, exemplifying what his justice looks like, as the word says, to have our good works seen before men, that it honors our Father in heaven. That's what it really should look like. And so that's why when I get into conversations, like honestly, I don't even have conversations anymore about Black Lives Matter and whether it's right or wrong, unless we're going to talk about how we can not just oppose Black Lives Matter, but replace Black Lives Matter and say, well, okay, now we can agree, that we're not, that they stand for some terrible things, and I mean, we can go into that, but what are we going to do now? I'm saying, are we going to just leave that to May, or are we going to now say let's as Christians, as the church, take our rightful place and live out the biblical ethic of justice?
That's a super interesting point that you mentioned, Adam. The idea that as the church has kind of abdicated its place in the public square, the other entities have taken over. And I think that's what Dawkins and like Sam Harris and like Tom Holland are kind of getting at. They don't particularly like religion, but they recognize that when religion, in our specific case, the true religion, Christianity, takes a step back, it's not as though people just shut that part of their brain off. Like, I believe God created us. I believe the reason why religion pops up in so many different forms is because I believe God did create us with that type of religious type of mindset to be followers of, well, ultimately of Jesus. And so when people have rejected that, they're not going to just stop being religious. They're going to find some other entity to put their faith in. So, if Black Lives Matter is there, that becomes their means of, salvation, so to speak,
Right.
because they can continually follow the, creed or the commandments that, I'm speaking sort of, analogously, but that Black Lives Matter puts forward as a way of attaining salvation. But the sad part is there isn't any salvation at the end. All you end up with is you're chasing something that can't exist, that we only get through Jesus. And that's the thing where I think the atheists miss is something is going to fill that religious void. We're all recognizing the problems in this world, and we're all searching for a solution to those problems. But without Jesus, there's nothing there to actually save us. It's just going to be an endless cycle of pursuing all of these different worldly solutions that don't ultimately end up working. And so it's just very, very sad to see that happen. And what Christians should be doing is, people have this mindset that they need to attain salvation. Like, that's perfect. We can just say, hey, it's Jesus. Like, Jesus is what you're searching for. And that's, I think that was a really interesting point, because I've been thinking about that the same way.
Yeah.
Like
that's been a big complaint of mine for a long time, that all these other institutions exist because basically the church dropped the ball. Like, think about how many charities, how many organizations were started by the church. The church, Christian church, started universities. We started hospitals.
Yeah.
And then, like, once they're set up, like nowadays, we're like, all right, that's that organization's job. But then don't get mad that those other organizations aren't doing things the way you want. Like, how many Christian, let's say, that lean Republican or conservative, they complained about things like welfare. They complained about things like bailouts and whatnot. And I'm looking at, like, well, yeah, if you did your job, church, welfare wouldn't need to exist. Like, all these other institutions wouldn't need to exist. Like Christians complaining, why could any Christian ever vote Democrat? It's like, because you know what? The Democratic Party, at least, whether you believe that they're compassionate or not, at least they have compassion built into their platform. Even if we think it's fake compassion, whatever people want to argue, but they do say that they care about the poor. They want to create programs. And it's just like, well, if the church were doing this, then these programs wouldn't need to exist. If we were putting money in their offering plate to actually go to the poor and not to have, like, nicer siding put on the church, or like, comfier chairs, and actually took care of the poor, these institutions wouldn't, need to exist. And hey, taxes will go down too. It's a win-win.
Or it may not be a matter of welfare. It may be, on a practical level, right? I mean, we could think about this concept of discipleship. Okay, God has called us to be good stewards over the resources that we have, right? Now, if you have individuals who are in your church and not doing so well financially or whatever, it's certainly within the realm of discipleship to say, hey, we're going to offer some budgeting classes. We're going to teach you how to manage your resources, so that you can be a better steward over what God has given you, right? And so now, the church is not only just addressing the spiritual side, but stewardship is spiritual to some extent, right? And so those kind of things, I think, matter. And now you might have some benevolence as well, because people do fall into various situations. I mean, there's no doubt about that. So I think there's various rooms for benevolence. But really, just to add to your point, I do think that the church can be this dynamic force for good in the public square, and not doing good just for good's sake. I think that's where we get into the social gospel stuff, but really doing good for the gospel's sake. You know what I'm saying? Because it exemplifies the character of God. And ultimately, we're pointing people to Christ. We should always be very explicit that that's what we're about, so they can't be confused that we're just doing good stuff. No, we're doing good stuff because we serve a good God and we want you to know him. That's really how it ought to be.
Right. I just want to make one more clarification, because Nuxa, I don't know how to say that name, said, I don't think that Black Lives Matter and Antifa are pursuing solutions. I think they're pursuing raw power. I would agree with that. What I'm talking about is those that look to those groups for solutions. I believe that, and marketers figured this out a while ago, that the religious impulse to follow something is incredibly strong, and you can use that to persuade people to do things, in marketers' case, to buy things. If you get them to believe they're like part of a movement, that they can make a real difference in doing that. And I believe that, like, probably the leaders of these institutions are almost like taking advantage of that idea in order to gain their own power. Wow. But the people that are following after these organizations, I believe they have, like, truly good intentions. They are seeing them as ways in which to find solutions. So yes, I agree, they are pursuing power, but I believe the people that would follow those organizations they genuinely do want solutions. So I just wanted to clarify.
And how could they not? I mean, to your point,
Yeah.
I mean, we think about it. If you take God out of the picture, and I don't know as much about Antifa, but I mean, as far as Black Lives Matter, as far as I can tell, they seem to be decidedly ungod, like against God. I mean, I feel from what I understand, they don't rock with God like that. So, if that's the case, you take God out of the picture, then, and you're trying to achieve moral ends, supposedly moral ends. What other mechanism do you have to achieve that by other than power? How can you achieve your will other than to gain power and then exert it over someone else? So, again, this is why it's so important, that we have biblically minded people. And I think this is what Tim was saying earlier. We have, see how I threw that out there? I wasn't sure which Tim it was, so I just said Tim. So,
one of the bald guys, one of the bald white guys.
Right. It's a way to cover all bases there, but yeah, that's a way. I forgot what I was saying because I was joking. But anyway, the part of biblical foundations matter. To Tim's point about philosophical foundations, I think that's what I was trying to do. Yeah. Tim Stratton.
Yeah. Fox, you want to take credit for that, don't you?
For what?
Never mind.
Sorry.
Well, Adam, I think it's interesting, and I think you hit the nail on the head there when you talked about why do we have these problems with these organizations that are unbiblical? It's because the church has dropped the ball. What was that quote you said? Do you remember the quote? You quoted somebody else.
Oh, about the church dropping the ball?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And I think the guy's name is like Vander or something, or I can't remember. But it's basically he was referring to cults. He said the cults are the unpaid bills of the church.
That's right. Yeah, and I think we can kind of look at, Black Lives Matter, the organization, and Antifa as cults. They're kind of like cults because cults get a lot of things right. They just mix in a lot of poison with the good stuff, right? You look at Mormonism, they get a lot of things right, but there's so much wrong with it. Jehovah's Witnesses, same thing. They get a lot of things right. They believe that God exists, for example, but there's a whole bunch of poison mixed in with good stuff. And so we can look at an organization like Black Lives Matter and realize they're getting some things right, but they have a lot of things that they get wrong. And we need to speak truth to all things as Christians. And so, hey, let's talk about what they get right. Let's focus on what they get wrong and talk about why we can't support them, even though we do affirm the statement that Black Lives Matter. So let's, with that in mind, talking about how the church has dropped the ball, let me get back to the article, because I talked about the headline, or the heading there was, I called it the catalyst of Christ. And I said that Jesus started the fundamental transformation of the world and handed it off to his followers 2,000 years ago. And we see that how, by just sharing the gospel, the Great Commission that we find in Matthew 28, really provided that catalyst to change the entire world. And I talked about how the torch has been continually passed down over centuries, and it's now in the hands of those who follow Christ today. And thankfully that Jesus made it clear, not only just the gospel message, but also how we ought to seek to continue making progress. You think of the term progressive, and it's usually non-Christians who talk about being progressive. And I said, well, what are you progressing toward? Because if Christianity is true, we know the end goal. We know how we ought to live in an objective sense. We know how we ought to treat each other in an objective sense. And so we know what we ought to progress towards. But yeah, Jesus told us how we ought to live in an objective sense. And Jesus summed up the entire law of Christ, how Christians ought to live, in two simple and easy to remember commands. You find this in Matthew 5 and 22 specifically. And I like to say that you can sum them up in two simple commands. Everybody love God first, and everybody love everybody, from your neighbors to your enemies, and even love them as yourself. So love yourself and love everybody else. Don't love yourself more than anybody else. Don't love others more than you. It's all about love. So love God first, and everybody love everybody. And then Jesus, being as cool as he is, he even painted a picture, so to speak, provided an example of what this might look like when he gave the parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke 10:25-37. And this is an example of how humans ought to go out of our way to make sure an individual of a different people group thrives and flourishes, even if those different ethnic people groups were previously hostile to each other. So this was like the closest thing we could find to racism probably in the Bible. Jews and Samaritans didn't like each other. They didn't get along. But the Samaritan, and I love how Jesus, a Jew, makes the Samaritan the hero here. And so Jesus goes out of the way of what that ought to look like. You make sure other people, even in other groups, that they flourish. That's how you show love. Anyway, in the article, I go on to survey other key passages in the New Testament about living at peace with everyone and the biblical command to coexist. I've written other articles on that bumper sticker that says coexist, and really that's a biblical idea that can't be logically grounded with other worldviews. And so I then followed these passages by noting that, when we choose to live according to the law of Christ, the teachings of the New Testament, then we bring glory to God. And with those teachings in mind, I said that Paul provides additional clarity in 1 Corinthians 10:31. He says, so whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. So that whatever you do, that sums up anything you can think of that you might do. So that would include how we protest. So what's Paul say? Whatever you do it all for the glory of God. Well, if protesting then is something that you're going to do, you better make sure it honors God. And Jesus makes it clear how we ought to treat other people. And when we do that, we are honoring God. So right away, we can see that if you're a Christian, you should protest, be involved in righteous, God-honoring, peaceful protests. But don't sin in your anger, like we talked about in our last conversation. Honor God with everything you do. And anyway, I finished that section of the article by saying this. I said, it doesn't take a New Testament theologian to reach the conclusion that the core elements of Christianity, as atheist Phil Zuckerman noted, are love, peace and nonviolence, and forgiveness. So what do you guys think of that?
Good.
I won't let that, man. I mean, whatever you do,
whatever.
The Lord of God.
Yeah, whatever. Fill in the blank with whatever you can think of. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, asking yourself the question: am I fueled by love, or am I allowing my anger to drive everything? Because people talk about, well, Jesus flipped tables. It's like Jesus put his Father first, and he said that you're turning my Father's house into a den of robbers. So it was his love for his Father that drove him to make some kind of action, which everybody thinks, well, since Jesus flipped tables, and I could flip tables no matter what, in every Facebook conversation or whatever, but Jesus was always driven by love in everything that he did. And people need to ask themselves that first and foremost: am I driven by love? Am I loving my neighbor by throwing a brick through their window? Am I loving my neighbor by burning down their business and their livelihood? Is this really how to love my neighbor? Be angry and do not sin. And you constantly have to ask yourself, am I doing this in love? Is this the loving thing to do? Mm-hmm. I think that's the critical thing to ask yourself. I'm like, yeah, love God, love others. All right. How does riots and violence fit into that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, another thing I think about too, it just popped in my head is the passage, and I'm not exactly sure where it is off the top of my head, but it talks about how if you know to do good and you don't do it, then to you it is sin. And so I almost said Pastor Tim. That's funny. So as Tim Stratton was saying, with like the parable of the Good Samaritan. I mean, we know to do good. Like we know that we're supposed to, be coming alongside people and loving people and helping people. And then, so, the Bible sets a pretty high bar. Like, when we don't do that, then God holds us accountable. God holds us accountable. Now, does that mean that, obviously we're all finite beings, so I don't have the resources to help everybody. But I do think that God calls us to be help agents, within the context that we're in. And if we're not doing that, then we really have to ask ourselves some questions like, why? Like, am I being loving? Why am I not compelled to go help others in my, circle of influence? I think that's a very real, that's a hard question. That's a hard question. Yeah.
Well, because Jesus even said, like, if you see somebody hungry and you don't feed them, it's like you did that to me. You snubbed me. So Jesus takes it personally when we ignore the poor and whatnot. He takes it personally. And in the Good Samaritan story, they weren't just common people who walked past the guy laying down beat up. These were religious people that, who knows, they might have been thinking, oh man, I'm late for service. I got to get going. Like who knows if they thought that they had good reasons. And Jesus was just like, no, helping people is why you exist.
Well, yeah, and to even take it further, let's say that you are somebody. The scripture that I had in mind, excuse me, it's Proverbs chapter 29, verse 2. It says, "When the righteous thrive, the people rejoice. When the wicked rule, the people groan." And I think that going back to what Tim Stratton was saying about doing all things to the glory of God. If you are in some position of authority, let's say that you're a governor, a mayor, a congressman, a police officer, whatever. If you're in a position of authority, do that to the glory of God. I'm saying, when that case comes before you, when you're arresting that individual or whatever place you find yourself in, do that to the glory of God. And if you don't, we have to understand that, when the wicked rule, the people groan, and we can expect that people who are unsaved are going to groan in ways that are ungodly, right? And so for me, I'm thinking like, if I'm, so again, I'm kind of going back to this kind of culpability issue. If I'm the mayor of Minnesota or Minneapolis, I get it mixed up. Yeah. Minneapolis, excuse me. If I'm the mayor of Minneapolis, and anybody in that chain of command, I have to say to myself, like, have I loved and have I glorified God in the way that I've, been, administering, going about doing my job? Because if I had arrested Derek Chauvin, not like 4 days later, I would not have allowed for things to go so haywire. Now, there's no way they could have predicted it, but I'm just saying that, they have to ask themselves those kind of questions. Am I loving my neighbor when I don't administer justice swiftly when it should be, and then set the stage for, worst calamity to happen? I would say probably not. And so wherever we are, we need to govern. And maybe that even applies to voters, right? I mean, like, we live in, I'm not sure how this plays out. I haven't thought it through, but we live in a democratic society, right? So we have some responsibility in terms of how we engage civically. We've got some influence there. And I feel like God is going to have something to say about, how we use that, either for his glory or not. I think that's a very real thing.
So, Adam, I've just got to stop you because Benjamin Handelman just said this Adam guy is brilliant. He should be making videos way more often than he does.
Right. Oh, yeah.
Get rid of us. We're
offer to pay his gas money, for like a year.
I was going to say, I think I've been saying the same thing since when did we start doing stuff together? Like back in 15 or 16 probably.
16, probably about 16, 2016, yeah.
We ran into each other on Facebook, and I was like, dude, we have to partner together. We
still rolling.
We're still rolling, man.
Yeah.
So, Adam, why'd you choose Benjamin Handelman as your alias?
But
is one of my supporters. He's with me on like a lot of my chats and stuff. You know what I mean? So that's my guy right there, man. So,
and Jake is in the mix. What's up, Jake?
Yeah, Jake, man. What's up, Jake? Yeah, Jake is the man. That's
Jake and I have had some really tough conversations lately on these issues and on what's with the whole police officer scandal now in Atlanta, and with the Brooks. What was Brooks' first name?
Rashard. Yeah, Rashard.
And just talking about the difference between that and what happened in Minneapolis. I know, there's disagreements all over the place, but hey, these are what I've appreciated is, again, with Jake, is being able to have tough conversations that might get sloppy, and knowing that we love each other through the whole thing. We're just working, trying to find our way towards truth. And that's why these conversations are vital. Sometimes I think it comes off better when you can actually hear the other's voice and see each other's facial expressions, things like that. When I type, I'm typing just like I'm talking, but it doesn't come through the same way. So whenever you're reading my stuff, reading my article, imagine me smiling and joking around and stuff like that.
You're really a fighter. We know what you're really like.
Well, I can.
But you know,
yeah.
Now, I wanted to jump off something Adam was talking about, though, talking about when the righteous rule and when the wicked rule. This speaks to the broader problem of evil, because people are like, where was God with George Floyd? Why didn't God this or that? Why didn't God intervene? But God gave us the ability to affect our culture and to vote certain people in and whatnot. Like, there's so many different pieces, and just to be like, well, where was God in this one instance? But yeah, we can vote people in. God has given government authority and expects the government to then to rule justly. And when governments don't rule justly, well, then this is what happens. So, God has given us this world to make the best of it. And he wants us to make good decisions. He wants rulers to rule well. And when rulers don't rule well, then we see the consequences, So it's just a tiny little piece, a tiny macrocosm, whichever, of the broader problem of evil that we're always talking about. But God gave us this world to have dominion over and to be stewards over. And when someone drops the ball, people get hurt. And the higher up you are in authority, the greater power you have, the bigger mistake you have, then the worse things get. So I think that speaks to the problem of evil.
That's a great point. I hadn't thought of it. That's a great point. Mm-hmm.
Hey, I don't know if you know this, Fox, but I actually wrote about the problem of evil in my dissertation, which will be a soon-to-be published book.
Well, I got you, man, because I've got a video I did on the problem of evil that's actually premiering in about an hour. So
there we go, man. Plug away, man. Plug away.
Amazing.
Right.
Oh,
Wait,
cool.
Tim, you have a dissertation?
Yeah, little thing I wrote.
You're a doctor now? What?
Oh man. Okay, so it sounds like we're all kind of in agreement of what you've said so far. So what on earth have people disagreed with you about on this article?
Yeah. Well, okay. So in that article, I had a little section entitled "Christians Opposing Christ," which seems kind of oxymoronic, right? Because Christians are those who follow Christ, not oppose Christ. But yeah, I'm saying, hey, we've got people here that are affirming the label Christian, but really opposing what Jesus taught. So, I said that today there seems to be many Christ followers who have chosen to stop following Christ. And I said, make no mistake, they've not converted to atheism or any other world religion. No, these Christians still affirm the label, but they choose to live in opposition to the teachings of Jesus and the core elements of Christianity. And I was then, I was careful to add that I completely understood why people were angry and even why espousing Christians were struggling with this. I mean, I was feeling the same struggle after I watched that video. We talked about that in the last video that we did. But I felt that same internal struggle when I saw the George Floyd, when I saw him being murdered by a white police officer while in custody. I wanted to go out and punch somebody, if I was going to be honest. But indeed, almost instantly, and think about this, this video went viral, but for a moment, the entire nation, including what seemed all races, right? The entire nation, red and yellow, black and white, every other color, we seemed to be united in outrage. Don't you think? I mean, just for even a few moments, the nation was united in outrage. And that was almost a beautiful thing to come out of an evil event. But we were united in outrage for a few moments. But that unification was seemingly short-lived. Although virtually the entire nation was ready to go out and peacefully protest side by side and demand change, many people, as we've talked about already, took what could have been a God-honoring protest and decided to engage in sinful and violent riots. And I pointed out that these riots included the destruction of property, looting, theft, bodily harm, and even murder. I mean, some of these videos I saw were horrific. And these violent riots, they haven't been anything close to the core elements of Christianity that, the atheists have been talking about, which have attracted even non-Christians to the cause of Christ. Those core elements of Christianity. Well, what we saw in these violent, sinful riots were anything but that. So, this is what really seemed to ruffle some feathers of some of my fellow Christians. I said, quote, "The problem is that many Christians have bought into the lie that if one is angry enough, indeed, if one possesses enough built up righteous anger, then it's perfectly acceptable to not love your neighbor, to not be a good Samaritan, and to ignore the teachings of Jesus as well as the law of Christ. In fact, many pastors have seemingly turned a blind eye and not used their platform to condemn this sinful violence." So I said that, and that kind of made some people unhappy, to say the least. So do you think they were justified in being mad at me?
No. They need a good reason. They need to back up why they think violence is justified. I've seen some people talk about, just war theory. It's like, this isn't a war. What are you talking about? And people trying to use all these other justifications. And you need to understand that the mentality it has turned into, like, the ends justify the means. That's what a lot of people are saying. And it's like, you're entering some really dangerous territory now. Some people saying, just as long as there's change, hey, then anything's acceptable. It's like, well, that's very bad reasoning, because then, we could go find the next George Floyd and then purposely turn him into, do something terrible just to incite a riot to cause change. Like that's horrible. That's a horrible thinking. You could do anything then as long as there's change. Yeah. It's just really, really dangerous thinking going on there.
All right. If that's just war, then what should the pro-lifers do?
Yeah.
60 million murdered babies. Yeah.
Fox is not a consequentialist.
No, not at all. Right. No. And because, and I've talked to Stratton about this a lot. It's like, if this is the case that Christians are going to justify, and even the world's going to justify, then don't you ever criticize Christianity about the Crusades. Don't ever criticize us about the Inquisition, about witch hunts. Because look, I'm going to look at that and say, yeah, a lot of that was evil. There might have been some good in the Crusades, but that's another conversation. But yeah, just saying, you know what, I need to pound God into you. And if you don't accept Christ, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to burn you at the stake. Going out and burning heretics. Like, no, that is evil. That is terrible. But now if you want to come at and say, no, well, the ends justify the means, and I could say the same thing, then there's nothing wrong with colonizers going and, taking over some village in Africa and say, convert to Christianity. If the end justifies the means, and if you're a consequentialist, then you can't condemn any of that, which I do. I don't, Christianity, free thinking ministries, we believe in free will. We believe in persuasion and God drawing people to him. We don't believe in, killing people. That you can't kill someone for the gospel. You can't coerce someone into Christianity. But you need to really be careful, the slippery slope that you're going to go down if you start condoning anything, so long as the end justifies the means.
That's right.
Well, yeah. So what I want to do too is, I guess I'm going to sound contradictory at first, but I'm going to circle back around to a point that I made earlier, and hopefully it'll be clear. So I want to kind of give voice to I think what some of the frustration is, and I agree with everything Tim said. I mean, you can't. There is no. A teacher. I mean, the student is not greater than his master. I mean, Jesus taught what he taught, and we need to abide by that. There's no doubt about that. And so I think what's going on is, let me go back to what you said a minute ago. You talked about how we were all unified, with the George Floyd thing. And I think that's true. I mean, it's something about this George Floyd situation that was very distinct from even something previous, like the Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and some of the more recent cases. And on the one hand, I noticed that there was this difference, and I was both encouraged and frustrated by it. And I was frustrated because I felt like with this George Floyd case, it was so clear cut. It was so obvious that this was wrong that people literally had, no rational person had any good reason to say otherwise. And I felt encouraged to see people stepping up that had previously not been, people that I know or people online. I felt encouraged by that, but then I was frustrated because why did it take this? Why did it have to take something this heinous to get people to, realize that the problem that people have been trying to point to for so long is indeed a problem? But and I think it's because in this case, like I said, it was so clear cut. I mean, with all the other cases, it's always like, well, if you hadn't resisted, or if you hadn't done this, or maybe there's always a what if that in some way I think people internalize as a comforting factor by which they can say it's not that bad, But in this case, we were just faced with depravity. It's like, know what, this is bad, and if this is going on, I've got to do something about it. Mm-hmm. And I just can't help but feel like, if we had listened, to folks back when Eric Garner said, I can't breathe, then we wouldn't have had to have a George Floyd possibly saying, I can't breathe. But it's always been, there's always a reason. Well, he was selling loose cigarettes. Well, I mean, all right, but, choke a dude out for that. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? Like, I mean, I get there's some dynamics there, but I mean, I think I'm being funny, but I think people see the point is that why should it take like this kind of extreme to draw attention? And so I think the frustration is, like, who wants this kind of thing to have to happen for people to see what's going on, number one. And then number two, it's like, okay, you don't want us, and I'm just giving voice to the situation. Like, you don't want us to, kneel at the flag because you're offended by that. You don't want us to march in the streets saying Black Lives Matter because then you say all lives matter. And so you don't like how that sounds. You don't want people to say anything on Facebook with, oh, what are you whining about? Slavery's over and Jim Crow's done. So it's all these lists of things where people say, well, look, I'm trying to tell you that there's a problem. And no matter which way I do it, whether it be protesting the flag or not, in any way, there's always a but, and so when you have that, yeah, people get frustrated. They say, you know what? As much as I don't want to endorse looting and rioting and that kind of stuff, if you didn't hear Kaepernick, maybe you'll hear them. Maybe you'll hear us now that people are burning stuff down. And it's frustrating because, again, I'll circle back around to my point. If the church would be the church, you know what I'm saying? If we would take it serious, you can't read through the Old Testament prophets without reading about justice and how God demands that of people. Like, it's impossible. You know what I'm saying? And so if the church would be the church.
Let me ask you this. What does biblical justice look like today in this matter? Because I think everybody wants justice, but maybe there's talking past each other like of what it should look like. I mean, what do you think, Adam? I mean, what should the church do to try to seek justice? Because you're saying the church needs to lead the way here. What's that look like?
Great question. So there's many different dynamics, and I want to concede at the outset that different theologians have different perspectives on what justice means and how attainable it is or not in this life. I'm going to give my perspective, and then I'll be crucified for it. But first of all, I don't believe that by human means we can ever achieve total justice. I think it's just beyond our ability, because I believe that justice in itself is a transcendent concept. It's something that flows from the very nature of God, and man in his fallenness we're just unable to attain that. We'll never we'll never get it completely right. But that doesn't mean to say that it's not an aim. You know what I'm saying? It just so I think for Christians, I think what we should expect for society, we would want to influence, nudge, be active in society toward the end that our systems, whether it be legal, economic, punitive, so forth, that they reflect, that they approximate to God's standard of what is righteous as much as humanly possible. Understand? I mean, look, again, I recognize everything's not going to be perfect because we're dealing with a broken world. But if we identify that there is maybe some policy, a perfect example, within the last 2 years or so, there was a lot of clamoring about justice in terms of sentencing. And then, both parties really came together, Republican, Democrat, Trump signed, this bill that will, I don't know all the dynamics of it, but it's supposed to, really eliminate some of the unjust or maybe, seemingly unfair sentencing that had been going on. That's a case where you can apply a policy, and then hopefully there will be an outcome such that the system is working towards, the aim of justice more so than it otherwise would. So, and I think that for Christians, we ought to always be exerting our influence as voters, as if we have some affiliation with a party, being a voice there. I'm thinking about in political terms. We ought, just it's going to be funny and kind of coin a Malcolm X phrase, but by any means necessary, within legal parameters. I'll add that caveat. By any means necessary within legal and moral parameters, we ought to be exercising our rights to influence the system, and then on top of that, justice is very dynamic. I mean, it's really a concept that works its way from the top on down in every level of society. And so if you're a business owner, doing justice might be something like, if you own a franchise, planning a one franchise in a economically distressed area to provide, jobs for people, and then giving people an opportunity by which they can advance themselves. That might be an expression of justice. Now, that would be more so Zedekiah, kind of like this notion of charity, so because there's two words that you find circling around this notion of justice in the scripture. You find Zedekiah and you find Mishpat, so depending on which one you're talking about, that there can be some implications there, but that'd be more so like Zedekiah. And versus Mishpat, you kind of, I want to say you're kind of dealing more so with the legal aspect and rendering right judgments. And so if you see a particular population, like the poor, for example, I'll use a perfect example. I think we have a real problem with our system of plea bargaining, meaning, you have individuals who get charged with stuff, and due to their economic situation, they can't afford to have proper representation, and we have a real problem with people taking pleas because it's better than just going to court and then taking a real loss. Like nobody should be in jeopardy of a jail sentence, you know what I'm saying, because they can't economically get themselves out of it. Nobody should be in that kind of position. Right. So these are the kind of things that we can rethink. Like maybe there's something about our public defender system that we can beef up, and that would be something that I think would be interesting. But I'm just kind of offering that as an example. So when I think about justice, I think about all levels of society. How can we, be change agents? I'm saying, how can we be that salt of our earth? How can we come alongside people and really work toward their well-being? Because really, that's what justice is all about. It's not just this abstract concept. It's in so many ways tied to well-being. And the best account that I think there is of well-being is obviously flows from the biblical worldview. So then you got anthropology that kind of flows in there as well. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be long-winded, but
that's why we're on the show.
Right. Right.
That's good.
Yeah.
Nothing. As I've been looking at some of the complaints recently, and I've seen some of the disparity between the sentences between a white person who commits a crime and a black person who commits a crime, and really all things being equal, and the white guy getting a much easier, he gets off easy, while the black guy goes to spend years in prison. I mean, that boils my blood, So I mean, I think there's some things that, maybe if it's Black Lives Matter, the organization, some things that they're seeking to change. They're like, no, that's throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Don't blow the whole thing up just because there's some problems. But then I look at some of these problems and I'm like, well, that should be an easy fix. Just treat everybody equally, and I don't know.
Well, I mean, it should be. I mean, the thing is, now one thing I do want to say is, while I do agree with your point, I think there's something that needs to be looked into. Justice doesn't have to be hasty. You know what I'm saying? I think sometimes people are hasty with it. Like when you see a disparity, then we ought to be careful to properly diagnose that disparity. You know what I'm saying? We want to say just because there's something that's uneven, maybe there's something going on there, maybe it isn't. That's where we want to investigate. Right. The problem is a lot of times people don't even want to investigate. It's like, whatever, we just let it be what it be, but that's something we need to look into. And I think that's justice too. I'm saying, like, if we think that there might be some kind of problem here, let's look into it. And if we find that there's a problem, take action. If we find that, things are just looks weird because they look weird, then so be it. But perfect example, I was talking to a friend of mine yesterday about African-American males. Obviously, it's unfortunate, but, between the ages of 18 and 25, I mean, there's a high rate of crime, and so a lot of people, point to that as being something that, I mean, it's, I don't know anybody who's rational who isn't concerned about that, really spend some time thinking about it. But, there's so many different ways to engage that problem. I mean, other than just locking people up, what I mean? I mean, it's when you think about crime is really downstream from a host of other societal things going on. And we need to make sure that we're treating problems, not symptoms. Because one thing I do know is that, and I'm not trying to be funny, but the guy that's on the street corner, he's not flying in drugs from Cancun or wherever else they fly in drugs from. You know what I'm saying? He's not trafficking drugs across the border. You know what I mean? It's funneling to him through some chain of wrongdoers, and it gets to the block and he's selling it to people in his town. But before you get there, what I want to know is, what are we doing at the border? What are we doing to root out that guy who's supposed to be watching the border but has been paid off and now he's going to turn a blind eye to that those tons of kilos or whatever that are coming across the border. Like, what are we doing about that guy? I'm saying, because then we can have, we can affect change on all levels. So we need to be, it's hard work, man. Morality is hard work. And and I hate to say it, but I just think that sometimes both in the church and outside the church, sometimes we're just too morally lazy to get up and do what we need to do. And we need to stop that. We need to be compelled by the gospel. I'm saying in the church, we need to be compelled by the gospel to do right, to do justice. Amen. Yeah.
So I had a question for Adam, specifically related to the George Floyd thing. And I know, like, we prefaced this all, like, sometimes when I say this, it sounds like, what the heck's this dude talking about? As it happens a lot. So the problem that I had with the George Floyd thing was the police brutality, right? Like the bad thing that happened to him, like, regardless if the cop was racist or not, the bad thing that happened to him was the cop killed him, right? Like, it's very possible that he had racist motives. Like, that's certainly possible. We don't really know, but there are other cases where, so for example, a few months ago, this dude, Duncan Lemp, who owned some guns, and the police claimed he owned them illegally. They had a warrant for his arrest, and then they sat on that warrant for like 2 or 3 months. And then one Sunday night at 4:30 in the morning, they decided to do a no-knock raid, bust into his house where he lived with his mom and his girlfriend, and shot him dead. Now, that is another example of police brutality, but like, that doesn't get any coverage because it doesn't have that racial component. And so I guess my question is maybe more like a tactical thing, is like, why, like, I guess I understand. So the black community doesn't see, like, it's not one of them. Like, there is definitely that aspect to it, but like, part of the reason you were talking about, like, why did it take George Floyd for this to matter to white people, basically, right?
Mm-hmm. Even when it's happening to other white people,
right? So what I'm saying is, like, could it be better if, like, organizations like Black Lives Matter are like, hey, it's happening to you too, this is a problem that we need to stop, like, just from a tactical perspective, like, rather than pulling the race thing in, which, like, is fine if we want to talk about like systemic racist issues, like that's fine, but in terms of like specifically like the police brutality thing, in order to get white people on board, like, why don't they talk about those other issues?
It's funny you should say that, because actually I just came across an article, and I apologize, I don't know the gentleman's name, but there was that video that came out maybe a year and some change ago, where you have white guy who's, I want to say they were in like a hallway or something like that.
Oh, Daniel Shaver. That's the
Daniel Shaver
died. Yep.
Yeah, Daniel Shaver. Yeah, right. So actually, Black Lives Matter was involved with his case. They actually did some protests. I just saw it the other day. Like, I guess they were in some way involved in advocacy for him. So they did involve themselves in that case. Now, I'm not sure
because you don't hear about it. Like, I didn't hear anything about it.
I know. Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing. And so now, mind you, my conspiracy theory cynic side is going to come out. I have a general
join the club.
I have a general distrust for the media. I mean, because we have to understand that they choose stories for a reason, and so there is always that element to it. And so, why and this is a testament to your point. I wasn't familiar with the name that you initially dropped. I remember Shaver, but I don't remember the guy that you're talking about.
Yeah.
But there are reasons why they don't broadcast stuff. So from the media standpoint, I think they have reasons why they don't hype certain things up. In terms of Black people, I think it's because with each of these incidents that happens to a George Floyd, Taylor, Eric Garner, Sandra Bland, it's basically saying, like, look, we've been telling you guys that this stuff is going on for forever. Now we've got it on video, and people still aren't listening. And so it's kind of like that dynamic. It's like, see, this is what I'm talking about. And when that's met with resistance, then it's like, well, why are you still not getting it? And then, to be honest, I mean, this, people may not like to hear it, but when it comes to a white person who's killed unjustifiably, to be honest, I think most people have every bit of confidence that case is probably going to get adjudicated properly. When Black people break the law, or when a white person is victimized, there's an expectation that something is going to be done about it. When it comes to a George Floyd and some of these other cases, it gets hairy. Like, we don't have that level of confidence that something is going to be done, and so we feel like we have to give voice to it. If we don't raise our voice, Derek Chauvin is still walking around for 3 days without getting arrested. Ahmaud Arbery was killed in February, and there's not an arrest made until May. Yeah, was it May? I think it was like May. What I'm saying, like early May or something like that. Whenever that case, became public, and it's like, it's not that they didn't have the video. It's not that they didn't. I mean, and I don't know if people are familiar with it, but the GBI officer just testified like a week or two ago that when Travis McMichael killed Ahmaud Arbery, he stood over his body and called him an effing N-word. You know what I'm saying? This is what the GBI officer testified. It wasn't new information. He already had that testimony. You know what I'm saying? Going back to whatever. You know what I'm saying? And so, no, this wasn't new, right? So why did it just come out later? So anyway, my point is, I think that the reason why the Black community gets jazzed up about these cases, and maybe not so much about the individual that you're talking about, is because we think that when white people get killed unjustifiably, and I'm saying, I know I can't speak for everybody in the Black community, but
sure,
I think that there's this expectation that somebody's going to go to jail. When it comes to Trayvon Martin or a number of other people, it's always these what ifs and all these kind of things that convolute, I think, what are clear cut moral issues, and we just don't know. We don't know if justice will be served.
Was Trayvon Martin killed by a police officer?
No, he was kind of. I was kind of associating him with Ahmaud Arbery because those were citizen type cases. That was right. I can't remember Zimmerman. That was Zimmerman. Yep. So yeah.
But no, to your point about the media, it is interesting. Like, because like I hadn't heard that they protested the Daniel Shaver thing.
Yeah.
But it is interesting. So like statistically, these cases of police brutality do happen twice as often to white people. Like, I know the disproportionality is definitely out of whack there, but like the number of cases is double on white people, but you don't ever hear about them in the media. Like, you only hear about like certain like racial where like it's a white cop on a black person. Like, and it's just interesting. Like, there's some other motive that I feel like the media is trying to like stir up like divisiveness by like not focusing on all of the horrors.
Well, I mean, and this is something that we kind of covered last time. I kind of gave some statistics, but there's a spectrum of abuses that occur between police and the Black community, that when we see these cases that are like high profile, like these are just kind of like the zenith or the worst expression of that spectrum of cases. I was talking to my mom about it the other day. So, my mom was pulled over. Mind you, she's, I don't want to give her age, but she's my mom, so you can kind of guess how old she might be. So, she was pulled over by a police officer maybe about 5 years ago. Asked for a license, all that kind of stuff. And as the police officer is going to his car, he says, "Don't let me find out that this car is stolen." My mom's a pastor. I mean, she's there was no reason for him to say that, but those are kind of this agitating kind of things. Or another example, I mean, I could go on and on about him, but sure. I was talking to a friend of mine yesterday. Like, I don't know a single Black person who either has experienced some form of abuse, disrespect, or what have you, or knows a family member, an immediate family member or friend who has. And so the thing is, these are the kind of things that aren't captured in a lot of the statistics. And so when we see stuff like, these high profile cases, we're like, look, this is what we've been trying to tell y'all. This is the kind of stuff that happens all the time. My grandfather, and it's going to sound crazy. I was at my grandfather's house about a week ago, right? And we were just talking about what's going on. He says to me, my grandfather is 97 years old. He says to me, "All right, so what I'm going to do is, if the police come to my house, I'm going to lock the door and I'm going to hit the button on my med alert, so that way I won't be here by myself when the police are here, and the medical people will come and I can have a witness just in case something happens." This is my 97-year-old grandfather. You know what I'm saying? Thinking that way. Saying nobody should have to feel that way at 97 years old. Yeah. And when he says to me, he said, because they don't see a 97-year-old man. At the end of the day, all that matters to him is that I'm Black. Wow. It's my 97-year-old grandfather. That's heartbreaking, man. But it's because it's all tied to this gross, recurrent spectrum of abuses that I mean, any black person will tell you about. We all know it's like to be pulled over for driving while black. And so anyway, so I think what happens is when these high profile cases happen, they're seen as being exceptions to the rule. You know what I'm saying, by most people. But what we're saying is no, they're not exceptions to the rule. Gotcha. These are just the most heinous examples of things that we've been trying to draw attention to.
I think did you listen to Sam Harris's the famous atheist Sam Harris did a 2-hour podcast just trying to survey this whole thing. And, I thought it was one of the basically my dissertation is against Sam Harris. I mean, I make a living arguing against Sam Harris. Yeah, I have to recommend his 2-hour podcast on this issue. I think it came out on June 12th. And I think one thing he noted, he brought in these stats that, they're with, I think, unarmed white people are killed. I think it was a 2-to-1 ratio. So I think it was like around 20%. Or what was it? Are you guys familiar with those stats?
Wait, say it one more time.
So unarmed, between unarmed black people and unarmed white people with police officers, I think there was around 100. I can't remember the stats. I just know there's more white people.
Right. Oh, no, that was the point I was making. In just raw numbers, like disproportionality aside, the brutality happens twice as often to white people.
Yeah, that's right. Now, I think he also said, however, that with just random stops and things like that, it's way higher in the black community. And so Adam, I think that's going to something you're talking about there is why there's that feeling, because it seems like if you look at what he was talking about, maybe that the black community is bullied more often, even if the white people are killed more often. And so that might go into how people perceive these things. I don't know.
That's a reality. Now you open a can of worms, and I have to spice it up a little bit. You know what I'm saying? A little bit. No, it's cool. I mean, but use the word perceive, and I think that's very important. Because so for example, I got pulled over a couple of years ago, and the officer says, "You know why I pulled you over?" I'm like, "No, I know I wasn't speeding." He says, "I pulled you over because you had a dim license plate light, not a brake light, not a headlight, a license plate light, and it was during the daytime." You know what I'm saying? It wasn't like it was at night or something like that. To where you couldn't see my license plate or anything like that. But anyway,
I'm not saying that's a true perception, right? So I'm saying
right.
That's right, wrong,
right. But see, here's the thing: is that actually, Tim, you got the martial arts background. Now sometimes my friends will laugh at me when I be watching MMA and stuff, because I might be watching around and I'll just be saying like overhand right. You know what I'm saying? And then the guy throws the overhand right, or I'll say push kick. You know what I'm saying? And then because I know I can tell by how somebody's standing, I can see what they're open for and things like that. And so because I used to do MMA, I've been conditioned to see things that other people can't see.
Right.
And as inflammatory as it sounds, I'm going to be honest. I think that there are times when black people are saying, look, I know what racism looks like. You know what I'm saying? And if you haven't spent time with, let's use an epistemological term, this notion of procedural knowledge. Procedural knowledge is like, kind of like when you learn to ride a bike and you know how to do things and stuff like that. It's vital for me to know how to recognize racism. I'm saying I can't afford to be relaxed or just kind of taking it easy in the presence of an officer who's a racist, because that could go really bad for me. So it's of the utmost importance that I have an understanding of what racism looks like. And I'm going to be honest, like when it comes to the white community, they don't have to have that lens on. I'm saying, because it's far less likely that you're going to encounter something like that with a police officer. You know what I'm saying? Right. And so what I'm saying is I think that there are instances where maybe there's confusion as to why black people think that there's racism going on in a particular instance or whatever. Is because, look, we deal with it all the time. And so
that's what I'm saying. I'm agreeing, Adam. I'm agreeing with that. And that's what,
that's
what Harris was trying to say too, is, so, I mean, you talk about epistemology. I mean, you're warranted in believing something unless you have data that comes in that provides a defeater. So some people will say, well, look at these stats of unarmed people who are killed by police officers. Way more white people are killed. But then you're saying, okay, well, that's something to consider. But you look at instances like that, getting pulled over for the license plate and knowing that you've got to be on your game if you get pulled over. Where if I get pulled over for that, I probably don't have to worry about it as much. Now I've had some interactions with police officers that weren't cool. But the most, I never worried about getting beat over it. I thought, well, I did not deserve this ticket. That's for sure.
Right. And let me clarify. I wasn't contradicting. I was trying to add another layer to your point. I mean, in terms of like where, why, like maybe a deeper story in terms of why people interpret those interactions in a certain way. Because some people might say, well, maybe they're just mistaken about, how those interactions going. But I'm just trying to add another layer to what you're saying, maybe an experiential layer, if you will, Right. But yeah, so it's real. Yeah.
Experiential knowledge is key. It's huge. I write about it quite a bit. And so you're exactly right. Hey, Glenn Pinson is saying hi to us.
Yeah, Glenn, man, that's my guy right there, man. Oh yeah, Maven. Yeah.
He's got a interesting question though. So he says, is racism systemic, which he defines as enforced by laws or social contract, or is it just prevalent and widespread?
That's a great question.
Can we get that done in 2 hours?
I know we have some more.
We have a half hour.
Hey, let me quickly say, I've been thinking about the systemic racism for a while, and man, I watched. I told you, Adam, the other day, I watched Just Mercy, the movie.
Oh yeah.
And man, watch that, and you'll see an example. This is a true story, and you'll see an example, I think, of systemic racism that happened in was it in Alabama? And that was in the 80s. I mean, you hear about stuff like this all the time from the 60s, before I was born. Man, I'm looking at something that happened in the 80s, and there's still people in prison that were, I mean, this guy would still be in prison if it wasn't basically for a miracle of this guy coming in and fighting for him. And there's still people in prison that don't deserve to be. Man, I'm hearing that now, and I'm like, we got to look into stuff like that.
Well,
go ahead.
Yeah, there's a lot of disagreement about like what it means for there to be systemic racism. I mean, and a lot of people will disagree with me on it in terms of what he said is racism systemic. I guess first of all, I do think that racism is prevalent. I do think that that's the case. I think that it's a sin, that unfortunately America is still working on, still got a ways to go. I think that's probably true. With that being said, I do want to be careful saying I don't think that racism and the systems that we have are inextricably linked to such an extent that reform could not expunge racism in the system wherever it is. Like, in other words, I would be in disagreement with the hardcore critical race theorists to say that to something, maybe if they subscribe to something like, systems need to be torn down. I don't think that's true. I think reform is possible. I do think that there are times when we think about systemic racism, I think sometimes people assume that means that it has to be some sort of present day policy, whereas I think that there are still reverberating effects from slavery and Jim Crow that are still having their workings out, economically and in other ways, in our society. And I would attribute that, or I would, label that as being a form of systemic racism. But even aside from that, sometimes we just have laws on the books, that people just have not been thoughtful about. And, they're having a disparate effect on one, segment of the population versus another. And just, it needs to be addressed. And finally, I think you have some people who are just straight up racist and unfortunately occupy positions of power. They had that guy, maybe this was just greed, I don't know, but there's a guy in, I don't know if it was, I felt like he was up north where he was a judge. He was just sending youth to jail for money. I mean, he was just getting paid left and right for sending, and who knows how many. Now, granted, I don't know if it was inclusive. I know there was a lot of black males that got sent up, but maybe there's others too. But I mean, there are evil people in places of power, and sometimes they can harness the system to exert racial hatred towards others. And so there could be pockets of systemic racism, even if the entire system isn't infected as well. So that, I hope that's not, too convoluted, but I feel like they're different. There are various levels of racism and extent to which the system can be impacted by racism or infected with racism. And I think we just can't discount it. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Okay, so we got about 30 minutes left, so let's move on to the next part. So, Tim, you noted in your article that some Christians might be a little bit confused because sometimes it seems that violence is a good thing. It's something that we are warranted in doing. You have made it abundantly clear in the past that you are not a pacifist.
Right.
I mean, like, what? So apparently, people call you the John Wick of Christian apologetics. Is that right?
Has somebody actually called you that?
Oh, I've been
Now.
called that. I've been called Jason Statham of apologetics.
Jason Statham. Right.
No, I think Tim just gave himself that name. But like, okay, so you discuss in your article. So when is violence justified? Because obviously you would say in some cases it is.
Definitely. And it's not always an easy question to answer, but it seems to me that the best way to understand when a Christian, or anybody else for that matter, is justified in resorting to violence is only when violence is the most loving thing to do in that extreme situation at that moment. Now, so that response might seem kind of oxymoronic, right? Because it might be hard to think of instances in which violence is actually the most loving thing to do. But that's the point. Violence should be extremely rare. In my article, I quoted J.P. Moreland and Norm Geisler. They wrote, quote, "To permit murder when one could have prevented it is morally wrong. To allow a rape when one could have hindered it is an evil. To watch an act of cruelty to children without trying to intervene is morally inexcusable. In brief, not resisting evil is an evil of omission, and an evil of omission can be just as evil as an evil of commission. Any man who refuses to protect his wife and children against a violent intruder fails them morally," end quote. And I would add that they fail God morally as well. So if that's the case, then pacifism is wrong. You could say I'm committed to pacifism, that I hope for pacifism, but you better be willing and able. I would argue Christians should be ready to throw down, hoping that they never have to. And that's why I know Adam and Fox. I don't know about Scott. Have you done martial arts?
I did 2 weeks of boxing.
Hey, we'll count it.
Yeah.
I know that
was always my philosophy. I'm practicing martial arts with the hopes that I'll never ever have to use it.
Right.
That's it. That's my philosophy.
Me too. That's why I train with.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah.
I train with firearms too, hoping I never have to use them. But I'm pretty good at it. I like to say I'm good at violence. I never ever have to use it. But sometimes it's the most loving thing to do. In extreme and rare circumstances, it's the most loving thing to do. So if one really is loving their neighbor as Jesus commanded, then one ought to be willing, and get this, as a last resort, to violently defend their neighbor from evil. But why? Because you love your neighbor as yourself. It's all about love. So the key words to focus on there, my answer is love and last resort, right? If you're not doing it, and if say you've got a gun, if pulling that trigger is not the most loving thing to do in that instance, then you are wrong. And if it was, or if it wasn't the last resort, and it should always be the most loving thing. I would just argue that I'll back up a little bit, but does that make sense? Talking about love and last resort.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you kind of even go on to spell out a couple of different cases in your article. So let's talk about those. So you discuss Dietrich Bonhoeffer's plan to assassinate Adolf Hitler. Obviously, the plan failed, and Bonhoeffer was murdered by the Nazis. But in that moment, his assassination attempt seemed to be noble. So you asked the following question: if it was noble for a Christian theologian to assassinate an end to the Nazi Holocaust, then why are the vast majority of Christians opposed to violence against Planned Parenthood workers that would lead to an end of the current Holocaust of abortion? So you have an example. For Dr. George Tiller was a leading abortionist in America. He gained national attention as the medical director of Women's Healthcare Services, which was one of only 3 abortion clinics nationwide at the time, which provided late termination of pregnancy. On May 31st, 2009, Tiller was fatally shot in the head by an anti-abortion extremist while Tiller was, ironically, attending a church service. So Christians possess a justified belief that abortion is murder, and the abortion industry in America has been responsible for around 60 million murders, compared to Hitler's 6 million. So why is it noble in your case, in your idea, in your mind, to assassinate Hitler, but not to execute George Tiller?
Yeah, well, the answer is simple. It was not the last resort. And this is why police officers, not to mention civilians who have concealed carry licenses, are only supposed to use their firearms when they believe it is a last resort. And, I know, at least as far as citizens go, they have to be able to show that it was a last resort. That there was no other way that either they were going to come out alive or somebody else was going to get out of there alive unless they pulled the trigger. So yeah, it's all about love and the last resort. And in the case of Hitler, it was the last resort. In the case of Tiller, it wasn't. You see, I mean, I do think America is the best nation to ever exist on the planet. Partly, and that when I say America is the best nation or the greatest nation to ever exist on the planet, that doesn't mean it's perfect. We're far from it. We can be so much better. It doesn't mean we're not filled with sin and so many other problems. But it is to say, where else do you want to go? I mean, that's how scary it is when we're thinking about this country falling apart. Where else are you going to go that's any better than this place? I mean, it's hard to think of some, but I think we do live in a great nation that allows its citizens to peacefully advocate for change. And so, see the Constitution's First Amendment. But change might not always happen as fast as we'd like. But nevertheless, Americans enjoy the freedom of speech and we can continually advocate for change. In fact, we've seen a change regarding the Holocaust of abortion because we have the freedom of speech to speak out against it and to educate people. And I think, so many apologists, and other theologians and pastors have done a great job educating our culture today. And many people are beginning to see that the pro-choice movement is really on the wrong side of history. And, not to mention science and logic. Abortion is evil, and people are starting to see that. As far as I can't give you exact numbers right now, but I've seen the numbers and the percentages that the abortion rates are starting to slow for the first time since 1973. So we're seeing a peaceful change. I mentioned earlier, man, if anybody would be justified and taken to the streets and being violent to see change, it would be the pro-life people who sincerely believe, for good reason, that you're killing 60 million babies. Is it right, Adam, that 30% around that number is African-American babies?
Yeah, I think it's like 1/3 or something. Like close to 1/3 is African-American. Yeah.
I've heard that in New York, there are more black babies aborted than born. I don't know if that's like, an exaggerated statistic, but that's what I've heard.
No, I want to say it's like, I think it was like 2 years ago that stat came out that year there was more black babies aborted than born, and that's why see, and this is why I come back to the importance of the church being the loudest voice for justice in any context. I'm saying, because if you don't have that right, if we're not in our place, then everybody else is going to get it wrong. I'm saying, here's the thing. And I know people are going to get mad at me when I say this, and I don't care. Trust and believe. I believe that the sentiment Black Lives Matter as much as anybody. You know what I'm saying? And I'm willing to stand on that truth. I'm willing to fight for it. I'm willing to go all in, But when it comes in terms of locking arms with people and, really pursuing truth and pursuing justice, listen, don't talk to me about Black Lives Matter if you're pro-choice. You know what I'm saying? Don't talk to me about Black Lives Matter if you don't care about the millions upon millions of Black babies that have been exterminated, right? I mean, if you want to talk, if we want to talk about lives and all that kind of stuff, I'm with it. I will march anywhere you want to go. You know what I'm saying? But at the end of the day, I do believe that consistency matters. You know what I'm saying? I believe that every life matters. I believe from the womb to the tomb. You know what I'm saying? I'm all about that. So I just want to be unequivocal about that because and because I want to challenge, and I'm be very explicit. I want to challenge people to let's make sure that we're seeing this thing through and being consistent in our morality. That's what I really want to do. Anybody that knows me knows that I've been loud about abortion. You know what I'm saying? I've got shows on it. I asked Scott Klusendorf on the show. You know what I'm saying? I've had Tim Stratton. I've had
on FreeThinking Ministries about it too.
Yep, that's what I was gonna say.
Yeah,
about being consistent. So if I'm going to get mad at the Derek Chauvins of the world, I got to keep that same energy when it comes to the modern day Margaret Sangers. I'm saying that's how I look at it. I got to keep that same energy. And so at the end of the day, I'm sorry. Now this is going to sound whatever. But I don't care. At the end of the day, we can't be genociding ourselves, you know what I'm saying, out of political relevance and then talking about we're going to bring about change. That makes just pragmatically, that makes no sense. Yep. It makes no sense. So even on that level, anybody who's concerned about change, then look, we need to be real about this stuff, So I'll leave that for another show, but I had to get that off my chest,
Yeah, but that's such an important point, though. Like, what is the Christian alternative to Black Lives Matter? That's the thing, because there are plenty of Christians who are like, yeah, okay, look, we don't like X, Y, and Z about Black Lives Matter, but what's your alternative? And that's what a lot of Christians are saying. They're like, look, I understand that there are these things that we don't agree with, but they're the best organization. That's what some people are arguing.
And shame on us.
Yeah.
Shame on me. Yeah. Shame on me for being, the true ID guy for 5 or 6 years now and having not started some sort of local or maybe a larger initiative to address social issues in my context and others. Shame on me. I'm saying I want to give a shout out to Nefertiti we talked about earlier. She actually just started an organization where she is active in terms of the political engagement and so forth, and working through legal means to seeing justice-related change. So shout out to her for that. But yeah, shame on us, including myself, that I haven't given my, brothers and sisters out there better options than to follow behind Black Lives Matter and burn stuff up. Shame on us. Now, the question is, what are we going to do now?
Well,
I agree with everything. Yeah, I agree with you, Fox. I'm with you.
And here's where it gets tricky, because we're talking about how we can strive for peaceful change.
Yeah.
Well, I know this is going to make some people mad. Maybe it'll make half the country mad, half the country happy. Again, we're just having sloppy conversations here. Asking for grace. But the primary reason why so many evangelicals voted for Trump is because they're seeking a peaceful end to the Holocaust of abortion. And so, that's the primary reason, is because they don't want to resort to violence. And we see this is how you can help bring a peaceful end to this problem. And so, I don't know.
I'm going to be explicit because, I don't want to lose my job. I have to be careful what I say politically. Now, here's what I'll say. I think that for anybody who says something like, they believe that, Trump is just a horrendous person, but he's not as horrendous as abortion, or something like that, and therefore on that basis, they voted for him. Or maybe let's say maybe they think that, I don't know, the most loving thing that they can do is ensure that our economic system is healthy, or, whatever. If you voted for the guy based on platform, then, I'm going to disagree with some people. I'm going to say, okay, we can have a conversation about that. However, I do think that Trump has become some sort of a cultist type figure where, regardless of what he does or says, people turn a blind eye, just kind of wink at sin with respect to his behavior and things that he says, to such a degree that it goes an extra step beyond, voting for a platform to affirming him as a person and performing and basically, if not affirming his behavior, turning a blind eye to it. And I think that when people do that, that's when they lose more credibility. Right. I'm saying, now the way to avoid that is to be explicit about where you stand on the issues, vote and why you vote along those lines. And then when you see sin, call a spade a spade. When he says something he shouldn't say, he says, man, look, well, I don't know if I should say this or not, but I I have a special
It's
heart
being
for
recorded. Remember, it's being recorded.
I gotta be careful. I have a special heart for America's veterans. You know what I'm saying? My dad was a veteran, God bless him. You know what I'm saying? And so when he says disparaging things about POWs, I'm not with that. And it needs to be condemned. You know what I'm saying? And you can condemn that behavior and still affirm the platform.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? There were he's only been a conservative for like 3 years. Let's be real.
Right.
He just became a conservative like yesterday. You know what I mean? So all the conservatism.
But he held a Bible the other day. He held a Bible.
I'm just saying all of conservatism. Oh, thank you, Jake Brown. Lift Every Voice Coalition. That's Nefertiti's organization. I would encourage people to check it out. And look into it. But all of conservatism and right values in the public square doesn't rise or fall whether on Donald Trump. You know what I'm saying, in his paper. So it's okay to say, you know what, I'm conservative through and through. You know what I mean? If that's what you are, and still can, not ride with his behavior. And I think that way you can maintain the moral credibility that one should.
And people, especially Christians, but really everybody should be logically consistent in that, no matter who your favorite politician is. Right. I like to say that I don't know a single theologian who I agree with on everything across the board. William Lane Craig, I probably agree with more than anybody else, but I can still find things that don't.
You're his clone.
What's that?
Because you're his clone, as so many people.
Yeah, right. And it comes that way with politicians too. I mean, I was, at 18 years old, I registered as a Republican. I didn't even know really why at the time. But then during the Bush administration, even though I voted for Bush, I became so disheartened with so many things that I said, I'm done. And I left the Republican Party. So to this day, I'm still an official independent. And I did that during the Bush administration. And I voted for Democrats, not for president, but in other, I voted for Bill Nelson in Nebraska. And, so.
Christians can do that?
Yeah.
Surprisingly, right?
Well, Stratton's an ex-Christian.
I'm what?
You're an ex-Christian.
Yeah, man. We're losing donations right now.
I kind of regretted voting for him, though. I regretted voting for Bill Nelson.
Okay, as long as you've repented.
Yeah. But be that as it may, I'm willing to call it when Trump does something good, I'll say good Trump. When he does something stupid, I'll say stupid Trump. When Obama did something, I didn't like a lot of Obama's policies, but when he did stuff that was good, I would sing his praises. So, it's just, Adam, to your point, we shouldn't have cult follow. we shouldn't look at politicians and have kind of a cult following there.
Yeah, perfect example. And Matt Jackson made a great point in the chat, in the live chat a second ago. He mentioned how, going back to 73, there were actually more conservative judges that voted in, Roe v. Wade versus, I guess it was considered to be liberals at the time. You're which right. The thing is, when you think about it, looking at the way that our government is structured, the judicial branch is supposed to be kind of, it's going to sound terrible, but like I guess party transcendent, or that sort of a thing. That's why they have lifelong terms. Right? And so now I think people make it, they feel comfortable making the abortion issue like it's a Democrat problem. Really, it's an American problem. It's an American sin. You know what I'm saying? And we need to oppose anybody who's on the left who advocates for it, and oppose anybody who's on the right who's not willing to go beyond lip service on it. You know what I'm saying? They put the fire under them, and that's what I wrote my article about for FreeThinking. But we need to stand up to that, man.
Well, I talk about that a little bit. So let's look at that in the article here.
Yeah.
So anyway, back to Tiller and Hitler. I said, bottom line, all peaceful options had not been exhausted regarding Tiller. When it came to Hitler, Bonhoeffer realized that violence was the only option remaining. And indeed, he was right. Although he failed in his attempt, America and company, they finished the job and defeated the Nazis by means of extreme violence. And indeed, if you think about it, it was the most loving option, really the only option available given the extreme circumstances at the time. And like I said, not only does this apply with Hitler, when this line of thinking also applies to self-defense situations. And I've explained this in an article that I wrote called Love Thy Neighbor and Pack Thy Heat on freethinkingministries.com. So I encourage you to see that.
Okay, so I have a thought about this. And it's this idea that, okay, people feel, and Adam, you talked about it before, like there's many of these situations that have happened, murders over the years of cops killing black people. And, it wasn't really until George Floyd that there was a unanimous, there was unanimous as, America can get, that, oh, this was a wrong thing to do. And so but even then, like, it took a while before, his killers were brought, longer than it should have, to justice. And it remains to be seen what's going to happen with them.
Right.
And so are people not justified in thinking riots might be the last resort? Because statistically speaking, riots work. Like, in the cities where riots have occurred, like, police brutality rates have gone down. Reforms were enacted. I think in New York City, it was after, was Eric Garner, was he in New York City?
New York City, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think after the Eric Garner thing, there was so much unrest, and there was violence that was happening in New York City. They issued a stand down, which basically meant the police were just going to enforce essential laws, which I don't know why we have non-essential laws, but whatever. And like, violence rates and like police brutality rates just plummeted. Now, unfortunately, they were like, okay, now we're going to go back to enforcing everything now. But like, for a while there, like, riots actually worked. And so, taking the devil's advocate is what I'm doing here. People are saying, hey, we've never gotten anywhere before. I feel like rioting we know it works, and it is our last resort. Now, I feel like people like us owe an argument that, like, no, it's not your last resort. We're listening. We're ready to make change. And so, like, there is a responsibility on our end to show them that they're not at their last resort.
Well, I think there's different ways to look at it. So on the one hand, when we say that rioting works, I guess I kind of look at like long-term change versus short-term. It might be too soon, in those cases to say whether there'll be like a long-term positive change. I don't know, it's not. Now, one thing is probably true is that, riots will bring about some change, but I actually did a study I came across the other day. I haven't finished it yet, but they were talking about how actually nonviolent efforts, there was a study done that said that they're actually more effective. And this is a study that was done, taking into account like America and something happened in Iran and just kind of different places around the globe. And they were talking about there's like 6 or 7 different reasons why nonviolent resistance, civil disobedience and things of that nature work more so in the long term. One of which is that you tend to get more buy-in from communities that are not, that don't necessarily have a skin in the game. You know what I mean? So when we think about like in America, Martin Luther King, for example, was able to get the esteem and support of the global community because, he was nonviolent. It's easier for people to be on your side if you're not, doing crazy stuff. So
right.
Anyway, I'm just saying that there's I understand there's different views on it, but I mean, there's studies that show that the civil disobedience route works in the long term.
I get that, but there's also the sense that, so back when Dr. King was marching and like peacefully protesting, that was in contrast to many, unrest, like a lot of unrest that happened. Like back then, when people would like, after a while, like black people would, were like fighting back against racists that would come into their neighborhoods and try and lynch them. They were finally like fighting back, and
Black Panthers, that's what they were about.
And so
that's a sense totally justified. That's fighting against people trying to lynch them,
or cops though. Like they would do it against cops as well.
In the case of in the case of the police, what the Black Panthers would do is, like, say if somebody's being arrested, then some of the Black Panthers would go out there with guns because they had a right to carry,
right,
and they would stand watch, while the arrest was taking place to according to them, to ensure that nothing ill would happen.
Right.
So that's an example that's not violent though. I mean, because they weren't shooting anybody. So I guess maybe that's a bad example.
I guess the point is,
and I'm cool with that.
Right. But I guess the point is,
wait, time out. Tim's he's cool with threatening violence.
Well, look, in that case,
Stratton is threatening violence 24/7. Just look at him. He's just always
never not.
Look out, Calvinists.
Right.
Look out, atheists.
Tim just said he's
Stratton's coming for you.
Was that guy Ben Yon that you guys were recently having? He better watch.
Man, watch out! Yeah, Tim's throwing hands.
I know, man. Watch out, France.
But
I guess to just sum up the end of my point is I think there's a legit argument to be made that Dr. King's peaceful protests were made more effective against the backdrop of violent protests because people were like, "Oh, I'd much rather deal with him than with violent protesters," and so they paid attention to the peaceful protests. Now, I mean, like, maybe that's not true, but like, I could see the argument being made. Again, I was just trying to play devil's advocate. I'm not advocating for violence like Stratton does.
Well, no, I mean, but to your point though, I mean, here's the reality: is I do think sometimes, and I don't mean, I'm not issuing this as like an ought. I'm just saying that it's just kind of a fact of the matter that when you reap consequences, then sometimes you can have a moment of reflection to say, well, you know what? I don't want that to happen again. Right. So let me do something else. And now I am in no way advocating, violence towards police officers or anything like that. However, I am saying that for those who are looking to honor God, in what they do, or if you're not a Christian, just do what you do with integrity. This is a time to say, you know what? Are we reaping what we've sown from turning a blind eye for all those times that we did see something go wrong that we didn't report, all those times that we know our partner, was doing wrong and we didn't do anything about it? Are we reaping what we sow from that? And let's just have an honest, I think they should have an honest assessment. Like, well, if that's the case, you know what, maybe, we need to, do something a little different here,
Now you're exactly right about that. And I found in some of my conversations on Facebook recently that many of these Christians and pastors and people with, maybe aspiring theologians, they were confusing this is what happens with the ought of it happening. And you just said, no, this is ought not what happened. This should not happen. We still have free will. We could have taken our thoughts captive and not done this, but you're also saying, but look, when people are treated like this long enough, these kinds of things happen, even though they shouldn't. So it's not like they're now given a pass of doing the right thing or something like that. They're still wrong, it's still sin, but we can at least understand why it's happening. And you're right, people have turned a blind eye for too long, and maybe we're
a perfect example. So there are times when in the scriptures, right, where God will use other nations to judge Israel, right? Yeah. Israel's messing up. So the Assyrians come in, the Babylonians come in, or whatever, and then you'll see other places where God will be like, look, I used y'all to chasten, Israel, but y'all were too happy about it. Y'all went too far, so now I'm going to judge you, right? Mm-hmm. And so likewise, it could be a situation where you have these consequences that a ruler, and I'm thinking in today's terms, like a mayor, governor, police officer, whatever, they're faced with these consequences, and yet still those who are doing wrong with rioting, unnecessarily violence, they're also still culpable for what they do. Sin is dynamic in that way. It doesn't have to be just one or the other. But to Scott's point, I think that you don't want to see. I don't think anybody wants to see people lose property unnecessarily. I don't know no rational person anyway. But when these things happen, then the next step, if you're being responsible over your office as a leader, then you have to say, well, what did I do? And it's like, think about like football. You know what I'm saying? Like, you see that in football all the time. Coach, why did y'all lose the game? Well, we got to put our guys in a better position. We got a game plan. There's this like they put it's like, that's on me. That's good leadership. You know what I'm saying? You don't get in. You don't go to the press conference at the end of the game and blame the kicker, for missing the field goal at the end of the game. You say, you know what? Our team should have been in that position in the first place. We got to do better. We all got to get better. That's good leadership. Mm-hmm. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. Okay. So as we wrap up, basically what about now? Like, how does this all that we've been talking about, how does it apply to current events in America? So Stratton, you said that Black Americans are justified in their anger, and that all Americans ought to be outraged when a citizen, whether he's a criminal or not, because like as you've over the past couple weeks, you've heard like, oh, George Floyd was he did all these bad things, but that doesn't justify what happened to him.
No.
Whether or not when a citizen, criminal or not, is slowly choked to death in front of the nation, like all Americans should be outraged when that happens. And not even in front of the nation. If you just hear about it, you should be outraged.
But now we had empirical evidence.
Right. Yeah. That really makes it more real for most people. So you even said that if you're not outraged by this justice, you are probably in sin. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, because anger is justified here. And I'm angry, and all people ought to be angry about the actions of this evil police officer. However, with this anger in mind, I asked the following question in my article, and I said, does this evil action by a despicable police officer justify not loving one's neighbor as themselves? Does this atrocity justify not being a good Samaritan? Does this murder justify breaking other people's property? Does the murder of George Floyd justify the murder of other people in the streets? And I continued and I said, let's make this personal. Would your anger against injustice justify your burning down my house? If I'm angry, can I burn down your house? Does it follow that if one does not love you, then you may throw away the teachings of Christ and not love your neighbors? Of course not. And I followed those rhetorical questions with this. I said, with the law of Christ in mind, it becomes clear that Christ followers, those who actually follow what Jesus said, taught, and exemplified, ought to go to extremes to be peaceful and to seek to continually change the world through love. That's not always possible, but then and only then is violence justified.
All right. Well, I feel like, you said a lot more in the article. Everyone should go read it. It will be linked in the video's description. It might already be. I'm not sure how this works. Either way, click on the link in the description to read the article because it's really good. And Tim is not condoning violence, like I was going to make it say. But yeah, no. So does any
out of context?
Yeah. So I think what we're going to do is wrap it up there. Sorry, Benjamin. I know Adam just got going. Like, trust me, all of us could just sit here and listen to him talk for, another 5 hours. Like, that'd have been great. But yeah, we're planning on doing these fairly regularly. So stay tuned for those. And I guess we'll talk to you guys next time.
See you guys.
Good convo, boys. Take care.
Yeah, it was great, man. It was great. Like